Welcome everyone to the School for Social Care Research webinar series. My name is Richard Hastings, so I'm chairing today. I don't think there's too much that I have to do, which is fantastic. But we have a sort of learning disability or intellectual disability kind of themed webinar today with two presenters. So Rachael Forrester-Jones from University of Bath and Rachael Clawson from University of Nottingham. So welcome to both of them. So we're running quite a tight schedule, so I won't take up any more time, but just to remind you, for those of you who've taken part in these before, or to let you know, those of you who've not joined one of these before, please keep muted so that we're not interrupted with additional sounds we don't want. And if you click on the bottom of your screen, which should come up that you can see this little bubble called chat. So what will happen when we get to the end of the each presentation is that I'll select from within the chat a number of questions to ask the presenters, so that we kind of keep things kind of nice and tight for the session today. So if you want a question asked or want to suggest a question, can you pop it in the Zoom chat, either to everyone, or you're welcome just to send it to me if you would prefer, and I'll select some of those to ask of the presenters. So without any more ado then, I'll hand over to Rachael Forrester-Jones, who is going to be talking about becoming less eligible, ? Intellectual disability services in the age of austerity.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you so much for zooming in, everybody. So this really is about austerity, and even just a bit of background before I get into it. Even before COVID-19, of course, increased longevity and a decade of austerity measures, including year-on-year budget cuts, left local authorities in England struggling to provide adult social care. An expanded private care market, the commissioning of cheaper care, leading to less attractive wages, has resulted in lower recruitment and retention of care workers, especially among those on 0 hours contracts. And the influence of Brexit on an already overstretched workforce capacity has resulted in a fragile adult social care market. Now, the Care Act of 2014 aimed to mitigate some of those impacts, including placing a legal duty on local authorities to assess people's needs and provide care and support for their well-being. And its introduction of universal and therefore a fairer, but arguably tighter eligible needs criteria, we think may have resulted in some people with intellectual disabilities becoming ineligible for support or eligible for less support than they had been receiving. So we aim to find out what impact austerity measures have had on people with intellectual disability. And here you can see the team. The team originated at the Tizard Centre at the University of Kent. Some of us are now elsewhere. I'm at Bath, Amy Randall's at Fight Bladder Cancer, and Melina Malley is at Oxford. And what I'm saying represents our views, not the views of NIHR SSCR or indeed the Department of Health for Social Care. So we first looked to see if there had been any previous studies on this topic. We found just 11. 5 in the UK, and studies did indicate that austerity cuts led to poorer outcomes for people with intellectual disabilities, but we found that the methods were often unclear, the samples were small, the smallest sample was 5, just 5, and the largest was 26 people with intellectual disabilities, and the samples were broad, so intellectual disability didn't always focus, it wasn't the focus of the study, or it wasn't analysed separately. So we wanted to add much needed evidence of impacts of austerity on these individuals. So 150 people agreed after a favourable ethical review was gained to talk to us about their quality of life, their social networks, their self-esteem, anxiety that they had, and we were also able to gather data on costs. Mainly quantitative, methods, we also had time and space for people to tell us more qualitatively about their experiences. Okay, so what did we find then? Well, we weren't able to get equal numbers of people in each part of England, and we say more about this in the report. There's much more detail in the report that's linked to this presentation. We ended up recruiting mainly through charitable organisations. Most of the sample were living on their own or with their family. The average age was 42 and over half of them were male. Most had mild learning disability. And we didn't get many people, we didn't manage to get many people who were not white British, and there may be various reasons for this. Other studies I've been involved in have found a lack of services that meet the needs of different ethnic groups. 88% of our sample were single, but that's not necessarily the situation they wanted to be in. In order to measure the impact of losing care, we separated out those who had lost care. We defined this in terms of the reduction in the number of hours people received from social care services. Those whose care had changed, so they, for example, they might have attended a day centre, but that had closed, and now they got one-to-one care, but they got the same amount of hours. Improved hours, more improved care or more hours, and care that had stayed the same. So those were our groups. And you can see from this chart that the largest proportion, 42% or 63 people had lost care. 21 people or 14% said their care had changed but not reduced. Just over a third or 36% said their care had stayed the same, but only 11 people, 7%, said their care had actually improved. One person still couldn't say whether their care had improved or not, or stayed the same. Now, we know that it's unlikely that people's needs will get lower. It's a lifelong developmental disability, and people's needs tend to get higher as they get older. So it's a problem if people are losing care. The mean costs of individuals' care was £30,000 per annum. That's including accommodation, health and social care. But there was a wide range from up to 200,000. And the mean costs were lowest for those whose care had stayed the same. But that included people, mainly people that lived with their families, and the lowest cost was only £8,269. Well, we know that, of course, most costs in families go unrecorded, so we think that's a complete underestimation of actually the cost. But in terms of the public purse, that was the cheapest form of care. The most expensive was 24-hour staffed residential home coming in at a mean cost of £73,000 a year. So what does life look like for those who had lost care? Well, over half were not engaged in any form of employment, and significantly fewer people, and those who had lost care were engaged in significantly fewer social and independent activities and fewer activities outside of the home. So what that meant for many was that life revolved around being at home with mum and dad or with family members. And those who had lost care also we found had lower quality of life scores. They had significantly lower self-esteem, and there was no difference in network size, but the average the size of individuals' networks was only 34, and that's very small compared to those of people without intellectual disabilities being between about 90 and 150, not counting Facebook contacts. Almost half said they no longer had opportunities to meet new people, and some said they were very, very lonely. 46% said they had no one to support them to meet new people as well. And although there was no significant difference in anxiety levels between those who had lost care and those who hadn't, 3/4 scored highly for having clinically significant anxiety. And there was also part and parcel of this anxiety was that people felt that they were going to lose benefits. I've included some quotes here, but there's lots more in the report that you can look at. But this just reflects one person who said that they were scared of becoming more independent or being more independent because they said they thought they'd then get they'd lose support, and of course you need support to enable to keep yourself independent, so it's counterintuitive. For those that had lost care, they tended to rely more and more on the family and on the third sector. And some had actually been referred to charities by social services or local authorities if they had lost care. And here you have a kind of inequality that starts emerging, where people who are with families who can afford to maybe top up support that's being lost or help people out, compared to those who don't have families and don't have that ability or opportunity to top up the support that they've lost. So the key messages then for this study are that the pressure on local authorities to make social care savings is completely irreconcilable with the rising needs of people with intellectual disabilities as they get older. The average age of our cohort was 42 and rising. The oldest were in their 70s. This means that they're relying more and more on older family carers who are often frail themselves and need support themselves. Austerity measures have certainly impacted negatively on the lives of people with intellectual disabilities who they themselves are aware of the support. You'll see in the Allied report that's launched today that people with intellectual disabilities knew they had lost care, they were able to say that they had lost it, and they definitely attributed it to cuts in services, and they were able to tell us this in no uncertain terms. The other point to make is that, of course, we're starting from after 10 years of reductions. We know that there are issues and problems with COVID-19 and the impact of that on the lives of people with intellectual disabilities and their families. And as we need to address those, we also need to remember that we are also need to address 10 years of cuts. That has to be taken into account in terms of resources and funding that's needed for local authorities to actually fulfil their legal duties under the Care Act to provide assessments and to provide care and support. And so really the key message here is that vast amounts of resources are needed, and the scale of that and the challenge cannot be underestimated. I think I've kept it very sleek, Richard, because I was concerned about time.
Well done. Completing within a good amount of time. I'm hoping that we'll start to generate some kind of questions now, but perhaps if I kick things off as we kind of wait perhaps for some questions to come in. I mean, one of the things that I was going to ask you about, Rachel, was I imagine you've not got many individuals in your sample within any particular one or small number of local authorities. But I was going to ask you about sort of, that level of impact. So whether there isn't variation in terms of what local authorities have been doing, and whether there was kind of, I guess, any indication that you could pick up on some of that in your sample, or whether you've got plans to perhaps try to look at that in a bit more detail in maybe more research.
I think you've hit on a really important point for future research, Richard, because there were two things that came out of our study in particular. The first is that local authorities were quite reticent to actually participate in the study in the first place, and therefore we weren't able to look at those differences in entirety. And there were various reasons for that. They were going through reorganisations, or they just didn't have the staff to be able to participate. And so in the end, our recruitment was through snowballing mainly, and through charitable organisations of individuals. Now we know that different local authorities are doing different things, and we can see that from the reaction of the Coronavirus Act, which has allowed for the easements of the Care Act, as you probably know. So the Care Act easements will allow local authorities in extremis to actually relax their legal duties to provide care assessments and to provide care. Now, initially there were 6 local authorities that triggered the Care Act easements. I'm very happy to say has gone down to one local authority now, but that in itself indicates that different local authorities are having different and particular problems and issues. And I think that the next study, if you like, I think really does need to be a comparison study between those local authorities about how they are faring. We didn't have any indication about those comparisons. We couldn't gather that data. The other issue, of course, is about data in terms of who is counting the number of people with learning disabilities in their particular local authority and how they're doing that. So very often the registers are not, they're disaggregated, or that there's nothing that you can actually grab hold of. I think that's just before COVID, local authorities were trying to redress that. But it was very, very difficult for local authorities to even say categorically, how many people with intellectual disabilities they have on their books and who those people are. And so, again, that was another reason why it was difficult for us to actually find people through local authorities. I don't know if that answers your question.
That's great, thanks, Rachel. So we're getting some positive comments about how useful the research is. Angie, I'm wondering if you can stick the link to the Rachel's report in the chat so that people can pick up on that.
Yeah, we'll do.
Thank you. And then we've got a couple of questions then coming in, Rachel. So one from Becky saying, well, given that some people were living in residential care, what sort of did loss of support look like for these people? Were they moved on to cheaper services, for example?
Very often in residential care, it meant there was less staff. So fewer staff for more people, which means that they would get less one-to-ones within residential care. And also what was coming out of it was not being able to go out. So if you have fewer staff, you can't actually go out for outings or get out of the home. Or indeed, I mean, holidays really were they'd gone. Again, we're talking about before COVID. We know that that's a particular kind of issue, but again, once that's over, you would hope that people would be able to get a break and have an outing. And as I said, the data showed in terms of activities that people were not really getting out of the home. Very often they were spending vast amounts of time, which backs up MENCAP's estimate that people are spending most of their days actually at home and not getting out for any fresh air or any other activity. It's not good for any of us, I think.
Yeah, thank you. So just to note, everybody, if you're not monitoring the chat, that Angie has put the link web address there for the PDF version of the full reports, and everyone can access that. So another question from Manny. You mentioned that, Rachel, that you didn't get a particularly good representation from different ethnic community groups. So is there a particular reason in terms of the sort of methodology you took, do you think, that kind of essentially biased things in that direction? Or
yes, and this is a limitation, and this is something that has, really we've been concerned about. As I said, in the end, we were getting our sample mainly through snowballing. So we were going through charitable organisations and NGOs who would present the research to the people that were using their services, and then those individuals would say, yes, I want to be interviewed, and then they might actually say, well, look, I've got a friend that wants to be interviewed, so that there was some of that going on. And those charitable organisations obviously were, the representation wasn't there. As I said in the presentation, it's very difficult for us to start diagnosing and saying why particularly, but the only suggestion I have is, because I've been engaged in other studies, that a lot of services are just not necessarily equipped to embrace the needs of particular groups, and that may be why they're not attending those particular organisations. However, I think, a next study on would have to more actively be able to try and recruit more substantially. I think that's the lesson, I think. But again, I think that there were various problems with the study in terms of slippage of time, because we had initially gone through local authorities and NHS organisations, and the samples weren't forthcoming, and so then we had to then go on to get who we could get.
Yeah, no, that's clear. Thank you. And one thing just to confirm for everyone, so the report link means that the report is out there in the public domain. So if you do want to use the report in any way, then that's absolutely fine. You can refer to it, you can use it, you can use the data from it. It's not, now it's out there in the public domain, it's kind of for everybody to use. So another question from James, Rachel, I was going to ask you. So I was wondering whether there were any examples in particular of people with higher support needs who'd actually lost hours of care.
No, not severe. There was no significant difference in. There was no association in costs and characteristics and needs, apart from if you had a severe intellectual disability. And of course, you would expect people with severe intellectual disability to have those higher support needs, and so we didn't necessarily come across that. It's mainly people with mild to moderate intellectual disabilities who were losing care. Not to say that that's just this sample, not to say that that's not happening.
Yeah, I think that might chime with what a number of people would be expecting as well. Thank you. One of the questions here, another one from Becky, was do you notice any different management structures, or kind of have any data that suggested any different management structures? So in another project on skilled support staff, it was clear that kind of managers were now responsible for more homes or had more responsibilities essentially since austerity. Was that anything that you picked up on that people were aware of?
Well, we didn't collect that data. I mean, one of the things that maybe I haven't said is that people were very upset that they hadn't really been told about cuts, and so these cuts would just suddenly emerge and they wouldn't be explained to them. And so that's a kind of a management issue, I think. And that comes out, you'll see some quotes there in the report that align with that. So I think generally in terms of management of cuts and services, the communication wasn't there, and indeed no sensitivity in communicating. And so people were feeling that, places were just closing down overnight, day centres, but also if they were having other kinds of support reduced, very often they were almost the last ones to know. So I think there's a huge problem there. This incidentally has happened with some of the triggering of the easements, which I think is why certain local authorities backtracked on that, because they hadn't been communicated properly, and that is then a legal issue.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure this is kind of directly, this won't necessarily be directly data that you will have had, but I wondered whether, or Francis is wondering whether you did pick up any information on it. So the Care Act obviously added responsibility for local authorities to support carers as well. Did you get any indication of sort of changes to unpaid carer support in particular?
Well, an allied study, which is being done by our PhD student, Rachael Harrison. That's part of her PhD, so she'll be writing about that. But certainly, and I think this resonates with what she was finding, certainly in another study that I've just completed on looming crisis of older informal carers. The Care Act, in terms of carers assessment, has not been terribly well worked through. People reporting that they haven't had those carer assessments, and when they do, they're not done terribly well by people that maybe don't necessarily understand not only their particular issues of older carers, but also just intellectual disabilities, certainly if it's a private organisation being drafted in to do those assessments. But also, even when the assessments are done, just not feeling that they get anything out of it. And so what is it? So I think yeah, I mean, that's, again, I've written quite extensively about that in another study on looming crisis of older informal carers. So certainly this study does highlight how families are taking up the slack. There's no doubt about it. And of course, you know, that's very good for the public purse, because it's the cheapest. It was amongst the cheapest form of cost of care. But you know, if we were to really go in there and count up the amount of hours that families are properly putting in, that they are putting in, then I think that cost would be absolutely sky high. You know, so there's a huge issue there.
No, I think you're absolutely right. Thank you, Rachel, and thank you everyone for your questions. I think we'll kind of take the opportunity to sort of segue into the next part of our meeting, if that's okay. So thank you very much for your presentation and for dealing with all those. By the way, Rachel, if you do have any published stuff on the carers work you were also talking about, given that that's of interest to people, would you be able to pop any links to anything in the chat while you're here? Yeah. That would be really handy.
I'll probably send it to Angie to do it.
Okay.
but I'll do
fine.
that right now. Shall I stop sharing, Richard?
Yeah, if you could. And if other Rachel, do you want to get set up? And then I'll just give a couple of notices that gives you a little bit of time to kind of get sorted.
Thank you so much, everybody, for listening. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you everyone for your questions. So just a couple of notices while Rachael Clawson's kind of getting her presentation ready. So about the next webinars. So for information, there's one next week on the 14th of July between 2 and 3:30 p.m, which is a capacity building webinar on statistical methods in social care research. So I assume, Angie, the information for that is on the website. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. And then the next of these sort of webinars is on the 28th of July, 1 to 2 p.m. again. And there are going to be presentations on the spotlight on capacity building work for social care professionals. So that's going to be the kind of key topic for next time. Okay, so Rachael, you're ready?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
So Rachel's going to be talking about, other Rachael here, forced marriages of adults with learning disabilities, developing knowledge, policy and practice to keep people safe. So again, just to remind you, everyone, if you think of questions as you go along, please pop them in the chat. But over to you, Rachael. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Richard. Hi, everybody. Thank you for logging in today to listen to this. So I'm going to be talking to you, as Richard was just saying, about our research project in relation to forced marriage of adults with learning disabilities. The project team was myself as project lead, Anne Patterson and Rachael Clawson, who are both based in the University of Nottingham, Dr. Michelle McCarthy, who's at Tizard Centre at the University of Kent, and we also worked in conjunction with two voluntary sector organisations. The Ancraft Trust, who are based at the University of Nottingham, work with agencies on different organisations to help better safeguard adults at risk and disabled children. And we also work with Respond, who are an organisation in London who provide therapeutic support to adults with learning disabilities. They've also got their own forced marriage project there, which is why we worked in conjunction with them as well. And also just a disclaimer that these are my own views and not necessarily those of the NIHR. So the work that we did built on 10 or 12 years of previous work looking at this issue, which essentially started when I was working with the Ancraft Trust. As a consultant, I was going around the country doing different bits of work in relation to safeguarding adults with learning disabilities. And different practitioners were telling me stories of people that they knew were married and they didn't think that they should be married because they didn't think that they really understood what marriage was all about. And they were questioning whether this was okay or not. So we went to the Forced Marriage Unit, which is a UK government home office, a joint home office and foreign and Commonwealth office unit, to ask them what they knew. And essentially they said, well, we don't really know very much. but we'd like to fund you to do some work, which is what they did. So, and I still work with them very closely today. So the first bit of research we did in sort of 2009, 2010 was really with practitioners and trying to get a sense of what practitioners knew about this issue. And that led to us writing the forced marriage guidelines, which you can see a picture of there, but they're now incorporated into the statutory guidance on forced marriage. And we did various other little bits I haven't got time to go into today, and it culminated in the project that I'm going to talk to you about today. So we started from the basis that forced marriage is a safeguarding issue, and some of the research that I did previously that was funded by the Forced Marriage Unit showed that local safeguarding boards, children and adults boards, hadn't necessarily embraced the guidance that we'd written. So a lot of them didn't really understand the very specific issues relating to people with learning disabilities when it came to forced marriage. And then there was a change in the law in 2014, and it's the Anti-Social Behaviour Crime and Policing Act, criminalises the act of forcing somebody to marry. So we wanted to know whether that had changed the landscape at all. What that act says is there's a section in the act that says very specifically that if somebody does not have the capacity to consent to marriage, that is a forced marriage. Now, for people with learning disabilities, the reasons for being forced into marriage can be very different to those people without learning disabilities. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But what that means is that forced marriage very often isn't recognised as forced marriage. So the purpose of the NIHR SSCR research project was to examine the lived experiences of people with learning disabilities who've been forced to marry, and to understand the issue from a whole range of different perspectives. Because, as I said earlier, the first bit of research we did looked at the perspectives of practitioners. But with the new legislation coming in, we were very much of the mind that it's no good just telling people that this is against the law if they don't really understand what it is. They don't really understand what forced marriage is. And ultimately, we wanted to improve safeguarding policy and practice in order to keep people safe. So phase one of the research, we did an analysis of all the data that the FMU hold on people with learning disabilities. And in phase two, we interviewed a number of different stakeholder groups. So people with learning disabilities, family carers, faith and community leaders, and a whole range of practitioners. What we found was, and it's really crucial that people understand that the typical motives for forcing somebody with a learning disability to marry, the key motive is actually obtaining a carer for the person with a learning disability. So these motives are very different to motives of people without learning disabilities. There might be pressure from extended family, marriage as a cultural norm, everybody should be married. It might be about obtaining a visa for somebody outside of the UK. Often families saw marriage as a rite of passage and thought it might, for the want of a better term, normalise the person with the learning disability. There's a view that if the person with the learning disability took on the marriage role, that this would somehow teach them how to live as a married person, as it were. Some people believed that it might cure the person of the learning disability, but first and foremost, it was about obtaining care for the person. So the findings from the FMU showed us that there was an increase year on year of cases being reported in respect to people with learning disabilities. Now, we saw this as a really positive thing because it doesn't necessarily mean that there are more cases happening, but it does mean that people are recognising it more and so reporting it more. But there are key differences between people with and without learning disabilities in terms of the statistics that it's really crucial that people working in safeguarding understand. So there are more cases of males than females with a learning disability being reported to the FMU. It's important to say as well that these cases are probably the tip of the iceberg because obviously not all cases get reported to the FMU. In the general population, the statistics are year on year, usually 80% female, 20% male being reported. For people with learning disabilities, it's much more 50-50. This year, I think it's 51% male and 49% female on the 2019 statistics, but some years it's been higher for men. Also, the age at which people with learning disabilities are reported as being at risk of forced marriage is older. than the general population. So the general population is usually between the ages of 15 and sort of 21, 22. For adults with learning disabilities, it's anywhere between 20 and 40. And this, we think, corresponds with the motivation linked to obtaining a carer. So as parents are getting older and are thinking we can't, you know, we're worried about what's going to happen to our son or daughter, they're far more likely then to marry off their son or daughter. So this has implications for practice and for policy, because a lot of the the old statutory guidance and a lot of policy really does focus on the fact that more women than men are forced to marry. But obviously for people with learning disabilities, that's different. So we need to be able to recognise that. So I'm going to move on a little to tell you a little bit about what each of the stakeholder groups told us. And people with learning disabilities, when we talked to them, a lot of them recognised it was their right to choose whether they should be married or not and who they should be married to. And they you know, thought very strongly that nobody else should tell you what to do. But there was a lot of discussion around if your mum and dad thought that this was the best thing for you, that actually it'd be quite difficult to say no to your mum and dad. And there were some scenarios that we presented people with, which were that, you know, your mum and dad wanted you to marry somebody that they thought was really very nice and they're going to take care of you and they'll be, you know, really kind to you. And so people were saying, well, yeah, you know, I do think that that would be okay. We did talk to a couple of people who had been forced to marry and who had, you know, really, really very difficult stories to tell. So there was an example of a woman who had been taken to Pakistan to be married. She didn't understand what marriage was about. She spent a week with her husband. She came back to the UK and he didn't. And in fact, he never came over to the UK. The family discovered that she was pregnant when she was about 7 months pregnant. The pregnancy continued, and when the baby was born, the baby was removed from her care. Now, this woman didn't understand what being pregnant was about. She didn't understand what childbirth was about. It was all hugely, hugely traumatic for her. And then the baby was removed. So I think some of the things that we sort of thought about in relation to people with learning disabilities was that those people with more access to the outside world, really, so to, you know, to watching things on telly or going to day centres or going to other kinds of clubs, they have much more of an idea about their own autonomy than those people that had less access to those things. Family carers talked quite a lot about motivations for marriage being intertwined with concerns about care, but also about what most people want for their kids is for them to be happy and for them to have relationships with people. And obviously for people with learning disabilities, that's no different, and parents talk quite a lot about that. And although family members were quite clear in the distinctions between arranged and forced marriage, those distinctions were sometimes clear, sometimes blurred, but many of them knew what forced marriage was and knew that that shouldn't happen, but they weren't aware of the law, so they didn't know that it was against the law, and there were no real clear understandings about capacity and how it might be assessed. So lots of family members thought that so long as their son or daughter could say yes to marriage or appeared happy about it, that they had the capacity to consent to that. So there were some real misunderstandings about that. But what families were saying was that the key was in finding the right partner. So the concerns are more about supporting the partner to care for their spouse with a learning disability than the risks that there might be to the person with the learning disability. And I'm aware in this presentation we haven't really talked that much about risks, but the risks posed to people include sexual and physical abuse, financial abuse, abandonment, and there are also risks to the non-disabled spouse who may not know that they're marrying somebody that has care needs. So we came across a number of stories where young women from other countries, so young women mostly in this country coming from India or Pakistan or Bangladesh, not speaking English, not knowing what their own rights were, and essentially being treated as a sort of a servant within the family home. So there are risks to them as well. Community and faith, we spoke to faith leaders from across all different faiths, and again most of them were aware of the law, but capacity to consent and assessment wasn't very well understood. So the issue about how this would be assessed wasn't well understood. Most felt that their role was largely about preparing and conducting marriage, so preparing people and conducting them for marriages, rather than influencing any choice to marry. So across religions, leaders were saying to us that we wouldn't get involved in the issue about whether people should marry or who they should marry. We would only really get involved once that decision had been made. And there were real assumptions around parents wanting what was best for their sons or daughters, and they were the ones that were sort of able to make these choices on behalf of their son or daughter. Practitioners told us that in their experience, future care concerns were the highest motivator. So families really are, as I said earlier, looking for somebody to care for their relative. In people without learning disabilities, as I'm sure a lot of you know, the motivators centre around controlling sons or daughters who might be perceived as being too westernised, controlling who you have a relationship with, how you dress, who you see, long-held family promises, keeping wealth and property within the family, and those kinds of things. And whilst for people with learning disabilities that might be present, by far the most common is obtaining a carer. So families don't see this as a forced marriage. Even families that understand what forced marriage is, because they see what they're doing is about caring for their child. And let's not forget that in lots of the communities that we're talking about in which this happens, so you know, families of Pakistani or Indian or Bangladeshi origin, for example, we're talking about you know, decades of care that's not been appropriate or not been available, or people don't know where to go to get care. And we're also talking about families who hold marriage in real high regard, and so want their children to be married, to be looked after. So practitioners were saying there are genuine misunderstandings amongst families about forced marriage and capacity to consent. So one of the things that we've been talking about is whether it's helpful to refer to this type of forced marriage as a forced marriage, or whether actually it's more helpful to think about it in terms of it being unlawful marriage. Because families, when we talked to the families that we interviewed, a lot of them were shocked to know that this would be against the law. So some practitioners are aware of the statutory guidelines and the law on forced marriage, and some weren't. And this very much depended upon you know, pockets of good practice. So there were some areas where there were pockets of absolutely fantastic practice, and we worked with a number of practitioners that we met through the interviews to develop practice guidance. And then there are other areas where practitioners had very, very little understanding about what the issues are. Assessment of capacity to consent to marriage was misunderstood as well by some practitioners. So most practitioners knew that the Mental Capacity Act, for example, doesn't allow a third party to make a decision that somebody else should consent to marriage. But some practitioners did think that you could make a best interest decision in relation to that. Lots of practitioners talked about the challenges in recognising, reporting and progressing cases, particularly where the social worker is working with a family whose ethnicity is different to their own, and there are concerns about being perceived as being racist or being culturally insensitive, and sometimes that impacted upon how cases were, whether cases were recognised or not, and how they were progressed. And some talked about the balance of maintaining a relationship where if your relationship had been a supportive one for a number of years, then all of a sudden you're investigating something that might be perceived as a safeguarding issue, then that can be really difficult. And where some practitioners talked about, some families were you know, quite shocked when they talked to them about forced marriage, and would work with them whilst the capacity for assessment for capacity was taken out. Other families worked really, really hard to make sure their child would get married, so they would take their child abroad, their son or daughter abroad. Some families commissioned expert assessments to counter the assessments that have been undertaken by social workers and psychologists and those kinds of things. So some families were quite protective when they realised what the risks might be, and others weren't. They were seeing that, you know, they wanted to do this. So when we were talking to the faith leaders, a number of them were saying, well, actually, we wouldn't see some of these marriages, because they would go to people would go to registry officers to get married. So we then registrars weren't part of our initial scoping, but we did then go to speak to registrars, and we're actually doing quite a lot of work with registrars at the moment. And I know from my work with the Home Office over the years that registrars are seen as the last line in defence, if you like. So they're very much seen as, you know, they're the gatekeepers. They won't let marriages go ahead if they don't think that people have got the capacity to consent. They've got a duty to stop the marriage. But what we found was actually registrars don't have a very clear understanding about what capacity to consent might mean, and they don't have a clear understanding of what the law says in relation to capacity and assessing capacity. And they were saying very clearly, you know, we are not equipped to do this. We haven't had the right training. You know, we don't really understand what capacity is. We don't want to get it wrong. There's a lot of pressure on particularly sessional registrars who are conducting the ceremonies themselves. And there, you know, there might be 2 of them in a room with 50 other people, and they would find it very, very difficult to actually stop a marriage at that point. And they're working within a culture of enablement. They're wanting people to get married. They're not wanting to stop the marriages from happening. So we're working quite closely with a group of registrars now to develop some guidelines for registrars who are in a really difficult situation in stopping a marriage from going ahead if they think the person doesn't have the capacity to consent. So some of the key challenges that have come out of all of this are there's a lot of work that needs to be done to help all stakeholder groups to understand issues of consent and what constitutes a forced marriage. People really see forced marriage as being when somebody is very clearly saying, no, I don't want to do this, or families are, you know, making sort of decisions behind their children's backs. For people with learning disabilities, that it often doesn't look like that, and so it's not recognised as a forced marriage. There needs to be some work done around working with practitioners who are, you know, worried about being perceived as being racist. There needs to be some raising awareness of the law and statutory guidance, and the statutory guidance is currently being reviewed at the moment, and there should be a new version of that coming out in the next few months. Assessing capacity to consent to marriage is a real complex issue in the terms of the assessment itself and the impact of decisions made, because we're coming very much from the perspective that, you know, people with learning disabilities should be supported to be married where they have the capacity to consent, or where they can develop capacity to consent. So we're absolutely not saying that we should go into this situation where everybody with a learning disability needs to be assessed, but we are saying that very careful questions need to be asked about whether capacity should be assessed, and if a decision is made that it shouldn't, it should be really clearly recorded why that's the case. We need to be thinking about what to do in cases where marriage has already taken place and it seems to be working for all concerned. So we interviewed one woman who didn't have capacity to consent to marriage, had been married for I think about 10 years and had a child. She and her husband were living within the extended family. The extended family had given the husband a job and helped with the care of the child. And actually, it was working for everybody involved in that situation. So there's some real sort of sensitive work that needs to be done around. Clearly that marriage had happened before the law had changed as well. So, but we need to be, you know, thinking about what happens in those situations. We need to be empowering people with learning disabilities to have a voice, to understand their rights in terms of saying no and being supported to say no, but also being supported to get capacity to consent if that's what they're wanting to do. And also the spouse with a learning disability can be a victim, as I said earlier on. So we've created a whole range of different resources for practitioners to use, and they're all available free from this website. We're actually in the process of developing our own website at the moment to sort of add more information to and provide a place for people to come for information and to discuss issues. So we've produced guidance and a toolkit to support practitioners about assessing capacity to consent to marry. We've created a film that's available in different languages and workbooks that go alongside that, and a case study report which tells the story really of the people that told their stories to us. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Rachel. And I've put that link as well in the chat. But the information there is a really nice summary of all that's on that website, which is really useful. Thank you. So please do pop your questions in the chat, and I'll kick things off to give people a chance to start writing. So I was particularly interested in that kind of essentially gender difference you kind of pointed out in terms of more males with a learning disability in this situation. I wondered whether in the work with family carers you'd got kind of any indication of what their thinking was, or whether there was any kind of thinking in relation to sort of males versus females in families and this situation.
I think it really is linked with this issue of care. Within some communities, that the notion is that the female does the caring and the male needs care. So the idea was that a wife would provide care for the son, and I think it wasn't more than that in most cases. It really was about, you know, who's going to look after my son when I'm no longer able to do it.
Okay, so no, I mean, because we've done some work around sort of family carers thinking about, especially in young people, their sort of attitudes towards sort of sexuality and sexual behaviour, and they've often reported being or seeing their daughters as much more vulnerable than they see their sons. I just kind of wondered whether there was any of that in what you picked up from family carers as well.
Yeah, no, that didn't come up. But what did come up was families of sons wanting grandchildren. So we did come across, and in fact, this story is told in our in the film that we made. We've got a story from a survivor who describes, she's a woman without a learning disability, describes being married to a man who she didn't know that he had a learning disability until the point at which they got married. And prior to that, she'd been building a relationship with a man on the phone who she was told would be her husband. And when she arrived on the day to get married, she wasn't married to the man that she'd been talking to on the phone. She was married to somebody else. And in that situation, she reports that the mother made the man watch pornographic films and then would incite him to have sex with the wife, essentially standing at the bedroom door shouting at him to tell him what to do, because she wanted to have a grandchild. So in that sense, he was abused by her, by the mother, and then the wife was abused by the husband and the mother. So, you know, some really, really difficult stories, difficult things that people have faced.
Absolutely. I was also intrigued by your suggestion that there may be a kind of different way of describing marriages here. So in terms of unlawful marriage instead of forced, I wondered whether, I mean, this is a naive question on my part, but whether that sort of idea is sort of gained any broader traction out there in this kind of context as well.
Yeah, it hasn't at the moment. We're doing some work as well at the moment on predatory marriage of people without capacity to consent. So we're linking it in with that as well. So we're hoping that it will gain traction as we start talking more about it. I think it's more helpful for people to understand it in terms of it being unlawful rather than it being forced.
It does seem naturally attractive, doesn't it? So we've got a question about sort of how hard, I think the question is sort of how hard the data collection was in the particular communities you were collecting data in, sort of what challenges in particular you faced.
That's a really good question. So for we were linked in with a really broad, we're very fortunate to have a really broad network of, you know, sort of different organisations that provide care and support to people with learning disabilities. So we went through organisations to interview people with learning disabilities and family carers. So we didn't have any particular difficulties in interviewing people from those two groups. Faith leaders, we had enormous difficulty in getting people to talk to us. Interestingly, we spoke to more imams than any other faith leaders. Imams that were very happy to talk to us, but people from the Catholic Church, Church of England, we found it very difficult to get anybody to talk to us, essentially. And we wanted to talk to sort of priests and vicars working it within communities, and the people that we were led to were people from the synod, so people much higher up than those working on the ground. So we were sort of thwarted in all sorts of ways from talking to a whole range of people from the different faith communities, and practitioners we had no problems with at all, because we, again, I think because of our networks, that was fairly easy.
Thank you.
And also the consequence of those, you know, the outcome of the assessment is really, it's absolutely crucial that we get the right outcome, so that we're, you know, so people's human rights aren't trampled all over, but also their right to be protected from harm, you know, is respected and acted upon. So we were really fortunate to work with a number of practitioners, social workers and psychologists, who had a lot of experience in assessing capacity to marry. So we worked with them to produce the guidance that we have put together. And what we're advocating is actually that the assessment should be multidisciplinary. So it should involve, say, a speech and language therapist or an OT, a psychologist and a social worker, to make sure that, bearing in mind it needs to be proportionate, but it also needs to be fair, and it needs to really represent you know, what the person is able to consent to and what they're not able to consent to. So it's quite a complex thing, I think, and it's more than, because registrars are expected, marriage registrars are expected to make a decision on the day. I think it's far more complex than that, and we wouldn't want people to be making snap decisions about whether somebody can or can't consent to marriage. So we've produced a whole range of tools and resources to help people do that.
Thank you very much. I think we're running out of time. So is there one final quick question anyone would like to ask that before we do run out of time? No? Okay. Well, thank you very much, School for Social Care Research, for putting this on as well, and to our speakers today, so Rachael Forrester-Jones and Rachael Clawson. Thank you very much for your presentations. Really interesting, and please everybody do kind of bear in mind the next webinars on the 14th and on the 28th, which are information in your chat, and the links to the kind of websites and reports as well that we'll put up during the call. So thank you very much everybody for attending, and thank you again to our speakers. Great to see you all. Take care then.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.